Welcome to today's developer meeting, focusing on bricks and how they can be deployed. Um, Handing over to Jacob, our software engineer, to walk us through it. Thanks.
All right. I've just got to share. Okay, you should be seeing Limfinity in my browser. All right, so today I'm going to take you through bricks and migrations. A brick is a method of transmitting Limfinity configuration from a source system to a target system. In real usage, the source system would probably be something like a dev site, and the target system would be probably a QA site or a UAT site, etc. For today's demo, I'm going to use a source system of my local machine, Limfinity running locally, and a target system of this developer sandbox we have set up for Brooks. All right, so what is a brick? A brick is a zip file which contains a number of YML files, each of those YML files describing a particular Limfinity construct and how it's configured in the source system. So user-defined fields would have a YML file, subject types, and so on. However, you don't really need to be concerned with the internals of a brick because the system manages all of that for you. And while they can be opened up and manually edited, it's not recommended to do so. All right, so now that we talked about the basics, let's go into defining a brick. I'm going to show you editing a brick, this one I have set up already, but the window for defining works much the same way. It looks like I've lost my session here. Give me one moment. And real quick, before I go any further, let me make sure I still have my session on this site. Okay. Okay. So the window for defining a new brick looks almost the same as the one for editing. So I'll go into that. So first of all, we'll talk about the name. The name of the brick is very significant in the sense that the target system uses the name to identify which bricks are the same thing. So I have this brick in here named patient demo, and I've already imported my patient demo into the target system. If I were to change the name in here to something else, and I import it into the target system would see that as totally a new brick, and it would try to recreate all of my subject types, UDFs, etc. That's not good, and that's not desirable behavior. So it's recommended that you choose a brick name initially and then never change it. If it truly needs to be changed, you can enlist the help of engineering to figure out how to do that. All right. The fields on here, description, brick author, and minimum required Limfinity version are for record-keeping purposes only. They're not used by the system. They're only there to tell you what the brick is for, who made it, and what the Limfinity version required for it is. Note that all bricks have a requirement that they must have the same Limfinity version for the source and target system within a couple of build cycles. So if the database schema for Limfinity has changed behind the scenes, you can't export a brick, say, from version 7.2 to version 7.4. It just doesn't work that way. So you could track in here for record-keeping purposes which Limfinity version it's being exported from, or you could just track, which version it was created on. It doesn't. It's for record-keeping purposes, so it doesn't matter a whole lot. The brick version number is also for record-keeping purposes, but by convention, it's used in the migrations to determine whether a particular migration needs to be performed or not. I'll get into migrations a little bit later on, but just note that this field is for record-keeping purposes, but it's also, by convention, significant. All right. So now we'll talk about the brick types. In earlier versions of Limfinity, there were only two brick types, baseline and itemized. And you would mark a brick as baseline or not by checking a box called baseline. And in newer versions of Limfinity, we've added a third type called delta. For baseline bricks, as the note here says, if you choose baseline brick, the entire configuration will be used. So that means all subject types, all UDFs, all workflows will be included. This is very convenient for dev sites because you want to create a very complex Limfinity configuration and not have to pick one by one the items which should be included in your brick. But if you do need to pick one by one, the option is there. You can click on itemized and you can choose the subject types, UDFs, etc. individually. This is useful when you have a couple of subject types which are separate from the rest of the system, but they go together in a brick. Finally, there's the delta brick, which is really only used in terms of limitless configuration. The delta brick contains all of the items which are not in any other brick. So if you have a baseline brick, say the base limitless configuration, and you have some customer configuration on top of that, the customer configuration could be a delta brick, and it commonly is, containing all of the items that are not in the baseline. All right, now I've covered the basics of bricks. I'll pause here if there are any questions on what I've covered so far. All right, great. So now let's talk about migrations. Migrations are used to change the data when your data schema changes. So occasionally when you're updating configuration, you'll end up changing the underlying database schema, and you'll need to make sure that the records themselves get updated too. It's the typical software development concept of a migration, except in the concept of, or in the context of Limfinity. Before I move on, I'll note that this dev system contains 2 bricks, SRF and patient demo. That's totally fine. It can contain 2 baseline bricks from 2 distinct systems, and as long as they don't collide in subject type name, UDF name, etc. So for that purpose, for the demo today, the subject type I'm working with is called patient2 because patient was already taken. So let's look at what the fields a patient2 has. A patient2 has a name, birthday, MRN, and some insurance information. And you'll note that I've mixed the 2 concepts here, right? A patient and insurance all on one subject. I mean, I've done this for demonstration purposes. In real life, insurance information will typically be separate from the patient's record, and that's because a patient may have more than one insurance information recorded. They might have multiple insurance cards with multiple companies, multiple guarantors, while they only have one birthday, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to perform a migration to split this out into 2 records, the patient information and the insurance information on a separate record. Now let's look in the source system where I've already done the work. In the source system, I've already split it out into patient2 and billing information. And a patient2 has only the fields which belong to a patient, and a billing information has all of the fields which are related to billing. And there can be, just like there's one billing information being linked here, they can have multiple. All right, so what would happen if I just took my configuration just like this and took it over to the target system? If there was no migration, it would create the billing information subject type, but the database would be totally empty. There would be no subjects of that type. That can be fine for certain situations, like if you're importing from dev to QA. It's okay if a QA site is missing some data, or missing, data can be manually created in there because it's all fake data anyhow. But a real customer would be very confused and perplexed if all of their data suddenly disappeared because you've changed the underlying data schema. So that's why you have to create a migration if your brick is eventually going to be applied to a production system. So let's talk about how that migration works. I've already gone through and created it in here. First of all, notice that the brick has a before script and an after script, just like many other things in Limfinity. The before script executes before the schema is changed, so before the configuration is actually imported. I'm not going to talk exactly about why you might want to do this. It's typically only used for very complicated migrations, so I don't really want to get into it. but just know that it's available. Most migrations live in the after script, which happens after the schema has already been changed, which makes sense. After the schema has been changed, we need to update the underlying data to match the schema. So you'll notice here at the top of the brick, at the top of the after script, I'm doing some stuff regarding version control. Note that this code, it never executes on the source system. It's actually written to execute on the target system, even though it's written in the source system. So here, the brick version is going to be equal to the brick that's being imported. So it will be this number. And the old brick version is going to be the number on the target system. It'll be this number. Currently, those two numbers are the same, but you need to be able to make sure that migrations don't get applied multiple times. So to that end, I will change the version number, having it end in a 1 to indicate that this migration will never need to be applied again, because on this particular target site, the schema number will already be 1 once I import this brick. So essentially, it'll be 0 to begin with, right? But then after I import it, for each subsequent import of the brick, the old schema version will be at least 1, and therefore this migration will never run again. One note is that sometimes old brick info may not exist, and that is because occasionally you're applying a brick to an empty database. For instance, spinning up a new production instance, it wouldn't have the brick in there already. All right, so let's talk about what this migration is actually doing. It's got all of the fields that I have identified as being billing related and not patient related, and it's saving that into an array called fields. Then it's iterating through every subject of the type patient2. And I'm doing this using a somewhat atypical method for Limfinity configurations, but very common for bricks and migrations. And that's using .subjects.findEach. FindEach is a convenient Rails method which brings a manageable portion of the set into memory at once. Some Limfinity queries would bring in the entire set into memory, which is fine if you have 1,000 records, but if you're dealing with 1,000,000 records, you can't bring them all into memory at once, or you're going to run into some errors, or possibly your code crashing, or possibly just general slowness. So this FindEach helps us bring them in manageable sets. It's very commonly used for migrations. I'm also extending this script runner helper. This has to be done because we're using these out-of-the-box Rails methods. This is typically done on each subject that's brought into memory, but we have to do it manually here to get our convenient methods. Then I am creating a billing information subject for each patient record that exists. I'm iterating through each of the fields, and I'm copying the information from the patient to the billing record. Then I'm setting that billing record's patient to the patient. Finally, I'm going through each of the fields and calling the remove prop method on the patient to erase the data. I'm doing that mostly for demonstration purposes. In a real migration where you're operating with production data, it may not be recommended that you erase the data afterwards. You could do it in a subsequent migration once you've made sure that your migration worked correctly. All right, so now that I've explained all of that, let's try it. To export a brick, select the brick in question and click Publish Brick in the source system. This is going to go pretty quickly because there's not very much in the brick. Then you go to your target system, click on the Install Brick, select the file, and click OK. Oh, whoops. I didn't try this yet because you can really only apply a migration once. Let's try it again. It was complaining about the fact that the UDF already existed called patient, which makes sense. All right. One more minor change to my migration code. There we go. Hopefully this will work, and if it doesn't, we'll just move on. There we go. Okay, so now if we go in and look at the patient 2 subject type, you'll notice that the fields have been cleaned up, and instead of all of the information living on the patient, it's been split into the billing record, which has its own set of information on it. And then all my records got copied correctly. All right, any questions on migrations? I have one last thing to cover before we wrap up and go to general questions. Okay, so the last thing to cover is UUIDs. And this comes up when in certain situations where the bricks get out of sync with one another. This rarely happens if you're doing everything the recommended way and creating everything inside of the dev site instead of creating things directly in target systems like in QA. But sometimes you might end up creating something in 2 systems in both your dev and your QA. And in that case, you might have to sync the UUIDs. The UUIDs are used for bricking, and they're used for bricking only. So if we notice that, if we look at in this system at the UUID of patient 2, you'll see that it has a particular subject type ID and a particular UUID. Same thing for the UUID in this system. But you'll notice that the subject ID is different, but the UUID is exactly the same. That's because the system uses the UUID to line up which subject types correspond in the source system and the target system. This is because, for instance, I may want to change the name of this record to, say something that makes a little bit more sense. And if I do that in this system, it needs to know in the target system that this record also needs to change. The name of this subject type needs to change. So it can't look it up by name since the name can change. It uses the UUIDs. These UUIDs can be manually edited using this tool as well. However, it's typically only used to manually edit them 2 UUIDs to make them the same in a case where they are not. And typically they are only not the same if the user has been doing something unintended, like creating the configuration directly in the target system instead of using the brick system to perform their updates. All right. Now I'm going to open it up for questions. First, let's start with any questions about the topics we covered today.
Jacob, this is Chandra. I have a question. When you make a brick itemized and say that you wanted to bring in user accounts. So when you make a brick, I see a option for picking users. Right. And so when you do users and you select users from the system, do we have to mark those user accounts as part of system? If you do, I know part of system means it'll be in the baseline, it'll automatically create those. But if it's not part of system, you can bring those users by brick like this?
I believe that's correct. You should try it. But I think if it's an itemized brick, you can select the user and you don't need to go mark them as part of the configuration.
Okay, so sounds good. Thanks. And sorry, one more question as well. So when you're doing a baseline brick, and we ended up one of this issue, I believe that if you have a tool associated with a workflow and then later on you remove it from the workflow and then re-add it, it does have a different index. Is that right? And so
yes.
Okay.
The UUID gets assigned when you create a tool. So if you added it in dev and then you later on delete it and then add it again in dev, it will have a different UUID. And that's because it gets assigned when it's created. And that's also the reason that they would get out of sync if you created tools in different sites, right? If you created a tool in the dev site and in the QA site, they're guaranteed to have different UUIDs because you created them in both instances, right? If you use the bricks to copy them, they'll have the same UUID because they were created from the source.
Probably eventually, but I have a meeting with Paul Trax next.
So if you end up having something like that, you can copy the UUID and to correct the problem. Will that fix the problem?
Yes, it will. So if you copy the UUID of the target system, or you
Yeah.
could copy from source to target, either way, as
Okay.
long as they have the same UUID, the brick system will see them as the same tool.
Okay.
And all of the internal, like everything internal to the instance runs off of the regular ID, not the UUID. And that means that changing the UUID doesn't risk corrupting the instance. Changing the regular IDs risks corrupting the instance. It's not possible through the GUI. It's only possible through scripting. And it's never recommended to do that.
Yeah, I've noticed. So, like sometimes when you are promoting into each instance, the UID is not always the same because it depends on how many records you have in the system at that point. So it indexes by the number of records in the system. So it's not always going to match.
Right, right.
Okay.
All right. Any more questions about what we covered today?
So, hi, this is Abdin. So one quick question. So if we remove a tool from a workflow in our development, how would we use a brick to remove the tool in the target system?
It should automatically be done based on the fact that these bricks track all that's inside of them, right? So if you open this brick up for editing, you'll see it's almost treated like an itemized brick on the installed version, right? You can see exactly what's in the brick, and it will and one of these tabs will list the tools. So essentially, what that means is when you export a brick that has a tool removed, which was previously in it, it would remove it on the target instance too. Does that make sense?
Yes. Does it also apply if it's a case where we've created the tool, we've just removed it from the workflow?
If you created the tool and just removed it from the workflow, yes, because workflows are also included in the bricks, and that includes their full definition. Right? So it's not just the name of the workflow, it's also what tools are on it, what states there are, etc.
And so to clarify, so this would only happen if the names of the bricks are the same?
Correct. The name does have to be the same because it treats it as the same brick, right? When you're installing it to the target system.
Got it. Thank you.
No problem.
One more question, Jacob. And I know in the brick page that we have install and download and all of that, and there is a button which is uninstall. I don't think it ever works, right? So I just wanted to know if you have a small itemized brick, not that one, that's a delete. So it's going to completely remove the brick from the system, but then there is uninstall. So it's not recommended, right? I don't think it works.
Well, uninstall does work if sometimes you have to manually delete subjects first, because if the thing is uninstall will go very slowly if you have a lot of subjects of the types covered in your bricks.
Okay.
So for instance, let's say I have a brick that includes the patient subject type, and I have a target system where there's 1 million patient records. If I try to uninstall the brick that contains the patient subject type, it has to first delete the 1 million patient records, which can take, in Limfinity, delete is pretty slow. We've optimized for update, we've optimized for create, but we haven't optimized for delete. And that's because typically you don't delete data. Delete is very slow in Limfinity. And so what we recommended is before you uninstall a brick, you actually write a manual migration script using like a tool or a scheduled script or something to delete all the subjects first. Okay. And then you can track the progress of that outside of the uninstall process.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Uninstall usually goes pretty fast as long as all the subjects are deleted first.
Thank you.
All right. We have probably about 4 minutes to cover. So if anybody has a general question about Limfinity that they'd like to ask.
this is more of a request for a future session, but could we have a session on custom views for subjects?
Yes, that's a great idea. Kim, are you taking notes?
I sure am.
Okay,
Thank you.
perfect. Yeah, we really appreciate all the suggestions because we rarely get them. So anybody who's curious about a particular topic, please make sure that that Kim's able to get your suggestion. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. I guess we'll wrap up.